So I'm now delighted to welcome my colleague, Dr. Parker Gassett. I guess he and I first started conversations back in 2015, and he's done a lot of wonderful things ever since. You often hear concerns in Maine and actually a lot of states about a brain drain, which is to say that all of these wonderful young people that have all this great talent that they're developing as they go through life, they maybe go away to college and people worry that they'll never come back. However, he made part of that happen. He grew up in Mid-Coast Maine, and then he headed off to college in Wisconsin. Happy to report that after he got his undergraduate degree, he came back to the University of Maine to do his graduate work, and he completed his PhD, and he'll be talking about some of that work here and the way that prepared him to do this important work. But it's great to have him in the state doing this important work. You may have noticed if you saw this talk on the website that there was a second speaker in Esperanza Stanshoff, who is also a wonderful leader. Parker, by the way, is a Marine Extension Associate with Maine Sea Grant, and Esperanza is a professor and climate change lead with Cooperative Extension and Maine Sea Grant, and a member of the Marine Extension team. So the two of them have been doing a lot of important work, and especially in the space of climate adaptation. Now, I don't know what your experience is with this. I grew up in parts of the United States that have been on fire for the last several years, including my hometown. But there's fires, there's hurricanes, there's inland flooding, there's sea level rise, there's ocean acidification. You'll hear more about this. So there's a lot of preparing we need to do as in our country and around the world. Don't know if you're aware that this is a growing focus of lots of professional organizations. About 10 years ago, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals was founded. And this is a place where people are trying to figure out what kind of expertise we're going to need, what kind of training should happen to help people work with communities that are facing challenges related to climate adaptation. As part of that, Parker and Esperanza have been doing really great work in something I know he'll be talking about, the Maine Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network. The shorthand is CCAP. And one of the great things that happens at the Mitchell Center, at the University of Maine, and around the state is the way people figure out how to collaborate on these things. So there's some of the leaders in the Mitchell Center, including Adam Dagnow and Bridie McGreevy, who've been leading something that is called the Resilience Assessment Framework, that's also intended to help guide communities that are trying to figure out how to build adaptive capacity for climate change and other challenges. So Parker and Esperanza and others are working with that Resilience Assessment Framework team together. And again, you'll hear more about this. Before I hand things over to Parker, I want to mention that we just kicked off this semester something we call career discussions with sustainability leaders. We did it last week with Dan Riker. It was a real fun discussion. We're doing it again right afterwards, after this talk at 4 o'clock down the hall. Anybody in the room that wants to join, feel free to come down if you didn't already sign up. If you want to do that virtually, you can connect with Ruth Halsworth via the chat, and she'll show you how to register for that. So I'm really looking forward to Parker's a great guy to give others advice about what he's learned moving into this field and what that takes, and a lot of good things. So hang around for that if you can. And now I will turn it over to Parker. The title of his talk is related to a project that the Mitchell Center is helping to fund. It's called Collaborating Toward Climate Solutions.
Thank you, David. So appreciative to be here. Really proud of this work and thrilled that so many people are here to join in person and virtually. I'm really thankful for your time. I'm speaking on behalf of a whole group that I'll introduce throughout the talk. And as is definitely a theme for this subject, many collaboration really is trying to be open to the variety of people who have been a part of this. And also, I think there's I'm especially pleased to be here at the Mitchell Center to give this talk because 5-6 years ago, the Mitchell Center itself was a really strong magnet for me to be thinking about the University of Maine. And at that time, and then throughout my graduate work, I really found that the kind of thinking that is happening through the Mitchell Center and through the many faculty and students that are involved with Mitchell Center programs, that kind of approach really shaped my own work. And I've been enormously mentored by the projects that have happened in this facility and the kinds of partnerships that have been established through this way of looking at problems and searching for solutions. So thank you especially for today. I'm going to take a moment, pull up my slides. Yeah, so thanks again for your time and joining today. So I'm going to talk about a municipal context around climate adaptation. And the focus of most of today's talk is going to be a project that we've been calling Collaborating Towards Climate Solutions. And over time, this work has really evolved in exciting ways, and we see a variety of different destinations for this CTCS work, but really proud of what's gone on since 2019 and of the variety of individual projects and also the kinds of partnerships that have emerged through this effort. So I'm speaking today on behalf of a large group of partners, and not only our kind of academic and practitioner team, but also the municipal representatives that we've started to work with. And as is the nature of collaborative efforts, not only our project team and the municipalities, but also many advisors to this kind of work and various practitioners throughout Maine and throughout the entire region that have really been available to consult with some of our ideas and brainstorm some things and share some places where they've had failures in the past and maybe we can learn from their experience. So thanks to the many folks involved and proud to be a spokesperson for our group today. So as a context for kind of grounding which parts of the project I'll talk about today, I'm going to focus on efforts that have happened in Mid-Coast Maine. And a number of municipalities in this area have kind of been our target audience for work around providing technical assistance to communities as they prepare for climate change and integrate climate science with their work. So we learned all this through a process that started in 2019 with interviews and network building with municipal officials. This is the hands-on, pick up the phone, see if you can get a hold of the town manager, go down to the town office, talk with the public works director, build those relationships. And then the last 2 years have been about responding to shared needs. You know, when different municipalities express really similar challenges that they face, we've tried to think of that at a higher level area and think about what is shared and what is common. And some of our approaches have been webinars and to create a website and produce guidance documents and a lot of individual town consulting. So those are just kind of that's the skeleton of the kind of work that we've been doing. But for the rest of the talk, I want to create more of a story around what this work has meant. And so I'll start with the reality for municipalities, try to kind of ground this into the real life, day-to-day activities at the town level. And then I'm going to talk about possibilities for integration, for integrating climate science into routine tasks and daily planning steps that most coastal municipalities in Maine may find common and that we've learned from with this smaller cohort in the mid-coast. I'll describe a toolbox for action, which is a growing set of resources produced and tailored for Maine communities. And I'll comment a little bit about some of the opportunities around sharing those tools and resources and really acknowledging the number of providers who have made that work possible in the past. And then I'll get into some of the groundwork for local change, what it's been like for us to integrate with town decision-making steps and to be a part of town processes and to kind of learn what that local decision-making space has looked like and how dynamic and diverse those kind of engagements can be. So, reality for municipalities. They are busy. If you talk with town officials, keeping up with the day-to-day is enormous. The sets of priorities that they have at any given month are just mind-boggling. It's very busy reality. The hustle and bustle of local communities along the coast is really exciting, but it also means that there's no particular staff that are waiting around to learn about climate science, nor do they necessarily have the time to do a deep dive, as many academics and practitioners have really had the privilege of engaging. And so, facing that context has been pretty remarkable. On the town to-do list are literally hundreds of projects. There's often critical infrastructure that needs capital improvement plans and needs maintenance and upgrades that are beyond the life cycles even of the existing infrastructure. So the day-to-day work of economic development, maintaining the roads, of working with the various committees that the town has, the challenges of putting that all into a budgetary context when you're also liaisoning with local voters and making the case for different town decisions. Plus, at any given time, local issues can be contentious and demand an enormous amount of time from public officials, just in managing that kind of real life dynamism at the local level. So we heard this a lot about, just keeping up with the day-to-day. That often takes priority. That was said in a context of keeping up with the day-to-day takes priority over thinking long-term about climate change. And yet, across the board with the municipalities that we've worked with over this past year, we've heard that climate adaptation is coming. We do want to focus on this. We are really excited about some kind of engagement, about some kind of effort there. And we feel like we're really behind. We don't have anything going on around climate change, but we'd like to start. That was a really common narrative that we heard. But then in reality, as we started to engage with municipal officials, as meetings turned from a few interviews into more routine engagement and interaction, we started to see a lot of shared challenges that to us kind of showed a different story. We started to see that across the board, stories of flooding on Main Street were more frequent. They were being noticed, obviously. Some of these impacts, here is Lincolnville, the town of Camden, and the town of Vinyl Haven, each with examples of Main Street awash, sometimes in a sunny day flooded situation. We started to see that local officials were very aware of obvious impacts. This is known. Climate change is not a foreign concept for 30 years from now. These things are happening. Vulnerable infrastructure, private infrastructure and public. We started to see that, in fact, a lot of observations have been made, have been collated together, that individual champions were taking notice of these kinds of things. Damage to roads, constant issue, and one that often didn't meet thresholds for the towns to document these kinds of challenges. But as you talk to the public works director, they're well aware. They know which areas are the biggest problems. They know how many trucks are going out each month to certain sites that are most vulnerable to this kind of heavy precipitation consequence. And in many communities, stormwater systems that are already out of date. And when it comes time to make those upgrades, they're having conversations with engineers and consultants about, well, what are the precipitation forecasts that we need to prepare for? Are we making these pipes bigger? And so despite a real lack of branding around climate adaptation, towns were saying, we haven't done anything, we're way behind. In reality, these challenges are the same kinds of environmental stresses that climate change practitioners are most concerned about. plus many more. Town officials are working closely with their emergency management plans. They're dealing with droughts, with drinking water. Winter storms are an annual subject of a lot of time and energy. List goes on. Communities are well aware of extreme weather events, and municipal staff are capable and adept at dealing with that responsively. And yet, with climate change, we know that the new norm is coming and some of these stressors are changing. So we felt like each of these routine activities for municipalities, these are options to integrate best practices for climate science, best practices for climate change, and what available climate science can inform the decision-making process at the local scale. Each of these day-to-day normal issues for municipalities to deal with are inroads for where climate science can help those decisions and those projects to be carried out. Now, how can we keep all of those doors open so that instead of climate change being viewed as an extracurricular activity that the town officials really need to learn about or they need a specialist in, that would be really helpful. But there's plenty of opportunities to integrate climate science into what is already the normal annual calendar of town activities. That light bulb moment can progress with the cycle of our knowledge about climate best practices, right? These are the inroads for the conversation. And we found also in these conversations that there was really commonly a history of various reports and analyses and inventories that have been done around extreme environmental conditions that all led to a patchwork of different climate change observations at the local level. Various partnerships with local conservation groups, projects where university faculty or NGO staff had come in and worked with the town, and a lot of those were sitting on the shelf, but some of them were still very much active. But those activities were somewhat discrete. They were kind of not yet integrated for most of the communities that we worked with. But we found that, once we started pulling on that thread about what work has been done in this area around flooding, around extreme precipitation, around drought and water quality and various subjects, that there were a lot of people connected to those themes at the local level. This idea of capacity from originally being very, very low suddenly was more of a, wait, we have this long history of activities that just have yet to be really integrated into a specific climate adaptation plan. We haven't yet gelled all these concepts into something that we feel is comprehensive and holistic for our own municipalities' approach to climate change. So these are kind of the light bulb moments that have really been exciting our team. We've been considering the community and landscape. We've been thinking about who is involved at different steps. What's the work that happened 10 years ago that is still relevant today? What are the features in the hazard mitigation plan that deal with a catastrophic event that are also somewhat synonymous with some of the projections for flooding? What are the ways that we can kind of integrate the knowledge and information that already exists into something that is comprehensive for climate change? So we as practitioners have been thinking about this inside the framework of climate adaptation. And our group has kind of put this together from a number of other frameworks that already existed, and also the expertise of the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network, collectively a Maine-based group. I'll speak more to that a little later. But for us, we see each of these kind of checkpoints in this circular framework as having the right inroad depending on the type of project. So when we've thought about community and landscape as it relates to climate change planning, we've been really focused on who's involved, who are the past partners that you've worked with, how local institutions been on board, or how has a school group been on board for a certain project? What's the history of who are the players that should be at the table? And maybe in the past, not all of those were there, but it gives kind of a starting place for thinking about what is capacity at a local level when you look beyond just municipal officials alone. In terms of risk assessment, oftentimes there are discrete assessments on an individual building, a particular road, maybe an assessment on the harbor, something that was a collaborative project with another state entity. And so how do we compile those various risk assessments to understanding the bigger whole, and how do we know what the information gaps are around risk? Various plans that relate to climate change, despite often not having that exact branding. And so each of these components of this framework, and I show this not to walk through each of the bullet points, but just to give the picture that climate adaptation, like many forms of project management, is a cyclical process and has various different checkpoints where you can kind of integrate into something that has, in itself, it has more resilience, because it's not going to be a one-off effort. It's going to be something that the community really learns from and allows it to grow over time. So I've been talking about CTCS, but really this work is under a larger umbrella of various climate adaptation efforts throughout the state. Other groups that are working with municipalities, other practitioners that are working individually as consultants. And a network I really want to highlight is the Climate Change Adaptation Providers Network, which is a Maine-based group, which has for a long time now been kind of convening as a group of practitioners to say, let's share our success stories. Let's share where we've had some failures. Let's develop some case studies about our work so that that patchwork nature of climate adaptation starts to be more of a quilt of what has actually happened in Maine. How do we make sure that we don't lose the knowledge when a certain NGO pivots and is no longer working as closely with climate change, or vice versa? You know, how do we keep all of that information and shared wisdom convened through some kind of network? And I'm really proud to be a part of this one. But then that is even under this larger umbrella of the Maine Climate Council and the work of the 6 working groups that are involved with that as another kind of social framework for bringing together all the best information and best approaches and the experience of Maine's community of experts on this subject. And also the experience of what they learned when they didn't get what they expected. You know, a lot of this is very dynamic. And I think another gesture to why it's so exciting to be doing this work through the Mitchell Center is that, you know, we recognize on the onset that work in real life is more complex than it is on paper. And so to bring all those experiences, we really wanted to create a kind of toolbox of that shared best practices. So our version of the toolbox, at least for now, is a website. So we used the Climate Change Adaptation Providers network website as a way to kind of pool what we had together as a prototype of collecting all those tools and information. So I'm going to start to walk through this website, not to show substantively a lot of the content, but to give you a sense of the scope and scale of how much exists on here. I think we're going to put that link right into the chat. So we've convened a number of examples of peer-to-peer connections, either case studies in real communities or ways that you can connect with other adaptation providers. And the list is large. There are tons of examples to draw from that are relatable to different sectors of municipal activities, but we tried to pool those together. For resources, we've put together the most useful tools for work in Maine that is Maine specific. So a number of GIS layers that talk about conservation areas or think about sea level rise and have various GIS viewers and different kind of physical tools that you can use to better understand the landscape of the risks that you face or the opportunities that are available to you if you're thinking holistically about climate change. So the list of tools is really exciting. I'm sure there are more to come. And I'll speak later on about the value, not just of having the tool, but of training the end user in those things. We've also put together funding and financing documents. And this is again an example where collaboration has gone beyond CTCS into a variety of other experts in this field and brought people together to say, hey, let's really brainstorm this. This is a needed resource for all of our work. So let's kind of come together and collaborate on these kinds of efforts. So I'm scrolling through this only to show that there are a lot of funding resources, and we've tried to put together this list as an easy way to see what the program is, the contact information, where the grant is coming from, who's eligible, and what is it really used for. All of this can be found on the website, and the URL is in the chat link now. Illustrating that there is a depth of information on this website. So for us, is the simple answer, we've put together the tools, we've made the website, here you go. Now go out and adapt. Community, here it is, here's all the information you need. We know it doesn't work like that. So now I'm gonna talk more about our groundwork of trying to integrate these tools and this information, this science, into the real world experience of municipal officials. Talk about this groundwork for change, how we've been opportunistic in which projects might be best informed by some climate science, and how we've been able to work with local leaders. We'll notice that the cast of characters is growing over time. And we found that to be the case in our own work. When we started with 1 or 2 municipal representatives in a community, that was our email list for workshops or webinars. And over time, that has really grown. There are other engaged citizens. There are the committee members in a particular town that are really the local champions of this work. And so our sense of who are we working with at a local scale has really grown and evolved over time. But I'll talk a little bit about our direct approaches. And the first one that is most obvious are we've had a lot of meetings. We've had a lot of network building workshops that have brought each municipality together around a shared topic or some kind of a look at a particular. At one point, we looked at this funding guide as a group and kind of walked through this as a group of 12 municipalities and kind of gave a lot of room for that cross conversation and hopefully building network capacity in between municipalities, not just between the municipalities and our team. So also a number of webinar presentations, that format of saying, okay, almost everyone has said they want information on sea level rise. Let's bring in an expert and talk about sea level rise. And then in the past year, a lot of individual town check-ins. So our team working with 1 or 2 liaisons to the town and just checking in on a variety of projects, kind of building that normalcy around us working together. So a lot of meetings. This has also been the year of Zoom meetings. So we're sensitive to not overplan. And I'll speak later to some of the kind of challenges and hiccups of the project, but we want to engage with towns, but we also don't want to over-engage. We don't want to be an annoying presence in their routine activities. So there's some nuance to that about how much we plan and when we feel like we should step back, when we should lean in. We've also used newsletters as a way to kind of give the quick recap of some of our work, but then also some of the achievements of individual towns that have nothing to do with us. So we've tried to celebrate those success stories. An example of that is some really great solar projects that are going on. And this is a theme across the state. A lot of towns regardless of their approach for climate change, are doing really exciting work on alternative energies. And so we try to celebrate things like that in a newsletter series and kind of keep this positive perspective going that, wow, you are doing great. You're really doing the right work. We've also found a huge inroad around green infrastructure. This has been like a topic that for us was maybe not as central to our first vision of what we'd be working on, but it's been just a lot of traction. Green infrastructure or nature-based solutions seems to be at the right nexus of town planners wanting to beautify the environments, protect their communities from various risks, and it's something that you can really see and feel and touch and experience in a way it's not only good for the community, but it's a good educational component of what the town's priorities are. So we've heard a lot of interest around, yeah, let's talk about green infrastructure. Let's work on that. So we put together a webinar from the UNH Stormwater Center. And a lot of the times, green infrastructure is especially helpful for thinking about how water moves through a landscape. And so stormwater systems are really often paired with green infrastructure plans. Similar story for flooding in many cases. So we've hosted some sessions on this topic specifically, and we've also started inviting these municipal representatives to other events that we see in our own email threads. You know, as something comes in from, for example, the SNEP program, the Southern New England Environmental Program, it's been doing amazing work on stormwater and amazing work on green infrastructure. So when we get that message in our email and it says webinar tomorrow, you know, we'll send that along, provide a little bit of context about how it related to our last conversation. And on any given day, there's a handful of the municipal officials that we've been working with who show up on that invite list and who join these other kind of third-party educational opportunities. That same has been true for providings from the Environmental Protection Agency. NOAA has a number of really great educational resources on these topics. So as different events from other providers come up, we've kind of tried to get them into the loop. And we funded a few small scale efforts around tree planting, and kind of we see these as like the seed projects for our own conversation. So one example, really cool thing in downtown Camden, this is right across from the post office and the bank, is putting a ginkgo tree into a sidewalk that instead of having one more parking space, we worked with the public works director, bumped out the area, put in a tree well, and then worked with a number of different local organizations or kind of subcommittees of the town to pick out a tree species that would really do well in that confined environment. So getting trees into the community. And this, you know, even though the impact of these individual projects is small compared to the scope and scale of climate change, this, you know, I see this as on-roads for more collaboration. These are kind of the visual touchstones of how communities start to integrate their thinking around these more big picture projects. We brought on some students as interns to do work with stormwater. So this past year, a number of projects that are related to GIS and mapping stormwater or mapping impervious surfaces. And it's been amazing to see that even when municipal officials are out straight with their daily calendars, bringing on board a student to help with kind of a side project or something, even some things that are pretty essential for the town, that student's ability to contribute has really broadened their ability to kind of keep pace with their initial plans. So some stormwater mapping, that's been a lot of, you know, on the ground, taking photos of the system, inventorying assets that, believe it or not, are like long out of date or maybe on paper maps that have been changed 3 times. So just getting that inventory has been helpful. Another student put together a story map on impervious surfaces. That's kind of a model for what we hope to provide for other communities. Another checkpoint for us, another inroad for how we've been working with towns has been this awesome tool called the Maine Flood Resilience Checklist. So this was produced by the state several years ago. And it's a really good way to integrate a lot of different town activities and the visions of communities into a perspective on how is that resilient to flooding. And so while flooding isn't the end all be all of climate change risks, it does cover a lot of ground. And so working with this Maine Flood Resilience Checklist has been a great kind of on paper and workshop and Zoom meeting exercise where we've brought together maybe 10 to 15 officials from a town. So a representative from the police and from the fire department and the public works and the town manager, and had a few hours to kind of inventory what has been done, what hasn't been done, and what are the priority next steps. And we see this probably as a really good precursor for including sea level rise and flooding into comprehensive planning. Oftentimes comprehensive planning is already dealing with flooding at least, but to kind of get that to the next level of integrating these concerns across the community. So as can be seen here, the checklist really appropriately bins different aspects of our conversation about flooding. Risk and vulnerability itself, which infrastructure and facilities are most at risk, the community planning process, the social and economic vulnerability that might be not so noticed by, depending on the process led to do an analysis of what was at risk. And then think about the natural environment, the role of conservation, protected lands, and public parks in this conversation around flooding. So that's been a really helpful tool for our work. And thus far, we're about halfway through the checklist process with the town of Camden, a little bit of work with Rockland and Islesboro. And hopefully this is like just a really useful thing for communities to go through. We can reach the entirety of the group with CTCS. Just a little bit more about the flood resilience process. In Camden, we were able to kind of go through some historic photos of flooding to make the case that you all have seen this before, but what was the major extreme event 100 years ago is the projected norm for what our state is telling us to plan for. And so how does that change your perspective? Yes, we've gone through some examples. The past might be useful for our understanding of what could happen, but we also know that climate change is very different than what the past has looked like. So it's been an exciting exercise, going to the public library, looking through the archives and kind of making this conversation be available to a broader group in the community that isn't necessarily as engaged in climate science when it is conceptual for them. And the commentary on past events has been a kind of a good conversation point for us. And some of the GIS work that's been done by students and kind of led by other team members in CTCS has been to provide maps, physical and GIS maps of the various sea level rise scenarios and important parts of the town. And it kind of like build out what are the assets that they have for their either public meetings or their internal dialogue to provide those as features that they have in hand. And then again, student work, an amazing story map on sea level rise where it can't be seen here, but there's a slider that shows, which scenario before and after, and you can scroll through and has a number of other informational sections on what sea level rise means economically and culturally for the town. So we think more of this to come, more ways of engaging students in the town needs, and more ways of just saying, hey, here's one more tool in your tool belt. We know you're interested in this conversation. We don't want you to have to start from scratch. Here's another thing that might be helpful. So that's been kind of this conversation around CTCS. I just want to take a couple minutes for some successes and some shortcomings. Not everything goes as planned. think this cartoon is really fun. If you look at the structure and Escher, get up here. So some forms of implementation, they seem great. And then when you come into the reality, there's a lot more hurdles, or there's new dynamics that we didn't foresee. There's unexpected challenges. And there's been a number of things where we're not totally confident in the work that we're doing. Some communities will kind of dip out, be less engaged, and we're not sure if we should be reaching back out because they just need the reminder, or maybe they're kind of prioritizing other things right now. Whereas other communities are all on board and we're getting daily phone calls and come on down to this site and check out this project. And is it right for us to put all of our energy into those partners that are most responsive? Or do we think about maybe they're most responsive because they already have more capacity than some of the other communities? If we really think about our equitable sharing of our resources and our time, how do we make sure that we're intentional with those steps? And the goal overall is that for these shared challenges, how do we make a recipe that makes it kind of easy to carry out the work? How do we operationalize some aspects of climate adaptation? We know it's not as easy as a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, but it's probably not impossible to have something that's become fairly normalized for what is the best approach for this kind of concern. What's a standard procedure of things to be checking off? What's the framework we should use to be thinking about this particular hazard, or this hazard in a context of our community or our economy? The goal, again, to make climate change adaptation easier. So I think one of the things that's been really helpful and really successful is that we're getting positive feedback. After a period of work with individual town, we're getting a lot of thank yous and wow, it's so great to have you here. And would you be willing to do work on this other kind of tertiary project, which to us didn't immediately seem like a climate change related effort. But then as we dig in a little deeper, very much is. And so, I think at least in these first few years, we've seen that there's a willingness to collaborate. Municipalities themselves have a lot more information and local ecological knowledge and experience around implementing big scale efforts. Maybe they have a lot more experience than maybe we realized, but there's also a lot of ways where they really are asking for our help. And there's a lot of climate science that can make some of those processes even more informed. So, and then the last story of success, I think, is that as we've worked with one or two liaisons, inevitably in every community, that cast of people who we're interacting with has grown. And, for me, when we think about the local capacity, we really, it behooves us to think more broadly than just the municipal staff alone, to really get a more thorough look at which local institutions have been involved in this kind of work, which are the local citizen champions who are really excited and can kind of do some of that community action organizing. Who is the broader community that's involved in this, who should definitely be included and be a part of how adaptation practitioners think about working with communities. So normalizing climate change adaptation. So with that, thank you for your time and your attention.
That was wonderful.
Take it away.
Okay. So much that's interesting. And I think one of the problems you're going to have next is a whole lot of the people here and that are listening from afar are going to want to be involved, and you're going to have your hands full because people are really interested. So just to briefly summarize some of the things we heard and then some of the questions, you helped us think about how important it is to collaborate towards climate solutions. that we need to learn from each other, but we also need to learn from our own failures and not to ignore those, but that those are really important. And that we have shared challenges, flooding on Main Street, frequent obvious impacts, vulnerable infrastructure, damage to roads, but that we're so busy that municipalities want to be involved, but we're so busy, it's hard. You gave us some wonderful examples of a toolbox, of websites, of how we could use peer-to-peer contact, resources, funding framework, direct approaches, network workshops, webinar presentations, town check-ins, a lot of not just saying, oh, this is important to do, but really interesting ideas for how to build capacity and how to develop checklists and how that can be helpful. And that giving us a sense of the impact that individual actions may look small, you put them all together and you got a lot. Not everything goes as planned, but lots does. And people had some questions about some of those interesting points you made. One of the questions was, your process is really interesting. Are you addressing mitigation in all this planning or just adaptation? And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, the mitigation side is happening on its own. And our team specifically is certainly on board with forms of alternative energies and thinking about energy conservation and energy efficiency. And a lot of the success stories that we shared in newsletters related to, solar on the waste transfer building was really successful in St. George. And later on, they asked us to host a webinar about solar energy with their local legislator. And so our engagement on alternative energies, I think, has been more driven from the communities themselves than from us, because the writing's on the wall about the economic success of many of those programs. And there's also just a huge kind of foundation of incentives and policies and expertise throughout the state that are really helping communities to transition for mitigation reasons. So we didn't feel that that was an area where the need was greatest. I think others would appropriately disagree and have at it. Where our skill set has come in more has been on thinking about adaptation, mostly to these environmental hazards. And throughout the talk, there are a number of climate change risks that weren't even mentioned. And I think that's important to really, have a sober assessment that we've done maybe a first pass of major stressors and challenges, but we haven't looked at a lot of other things, and the consequences are rippling, and they're cultural and they're dynamic. So, I think this is our first foray into this work, and ideally an area that really can expand.
Great, thank you. You helped us see how important municipal officials are, but also how much they have on their plates, how much they have to do. Do you have suggestions, or have you done things about getting everyday citizens involved? And in addition, thinking about like classrooms, teachers, children's libraries, are any of those things that we should be thinking about? And do you have any thoughts about that?
The more involved, the better. It's not necessarily our role as outside experts to try to organize and convene those things. But if that is kind of requested, or the idea is coming from the community, I think that, broadly, we have a lot of examples of, where there have been successful efforts elsewhere, or what are model forms of engagement or public outreach that are really effective. So for those who specialize in those areas, really great to share and get folks on board. I kind of think as an approach for how do you work with citizens, or how do you create those working relationships, is to remember that if you're involved with something voluntarily, you want it to be fun. So if you're thinking of meeting with someone from a local group, maybe that's not, let's plan an agenda for a meeting together over Zoom. Maybe that's, let's go get lunch, or, your boat's in the harbor. Would you like to go sailing and talk about these issues? How do you make the work integrated with the reasons that they want to be involved in the first place?
Interesting. You talked about the use of history, and it's important to think about history, like major flooding events in the past. Do you have suggestions for how we should use history, or who we should involve that would help us do that?
I don't think I'm the most expert in this subject because, it can be illustrative to show major extreme weather events in the past as a way of saying this really can happen and it's likely to happen more often and more intensely. But it can be you can be on thin ice around people saying, well, we've always had environmental challenges, therefore what's new? And so I would look to, I think at this point, there's a number of different historical impact mappers, maybe coming from the NOAA Resilience Toolkit throughout coastal environments. That could be a good, starting point to look at that. For our work with Camden, we genuinely went down to the public library and the historical society there and said, hey, is there a way we can word search flood in town history documents? And we pulled up some really interesting examples of, or at one point, immediately after a major flooding period in the town of Camden, a citizens group, the fire department, and the town office, and this is like 1905, created an overnight call center that had never been done to figure out where the flooding damages were happening. And it was this 24-hour decision to create a rapid response team around flooding in Camden that hadn't been done before. It's kind of an interesting conversation starter for the pace of decisions at the local scale.
Hey, Linda, we have a question here. Can I take a turn?
Sure, you bet.
Thank you, Parker. I wanted to come back to an idea you ended on, which was that moment where communities were inviting you to do that work. And I think that's a pretty powerful shift because usually it's people from universities coming up with these topics and approaching them. And you address this in a couple different ways, like growing the cast of characters and providing different inroads for new work. And I was just wondering if you could just reflect on that process of getting to that point of that relationship building where they're asking, inviting you into projects.
I think it's a fairly social process. A huge priority throughout the work in the CTCS efforts over the last few years. And again, this is, a dozen or so partners that have been the core team members of this project. And I think a theme that's been really consistent among us as practitioners has been the focus is on the community and the community success. So any way that we brand and frame the conversation is based on look at the achievement that you all have done as a community. And we're kind of stepping to the sidelines and letting their leadership really speak for itself and helping them to get there. So I think that kind of humility is really helpful in working with municipalities. And whenever I get the email that says, wow, so sorry I haven't responded to you, it's like, hey, no pressure at all. We'll meet you where you are. We're on your time frame. It's all good. Like, we want our networking to be enjoyable for you. So to kind of keep that away from the efficient, optimized collaboration into something that's a little bit more flexible and focused on their experience.
Linda, your turn if you got more. And I'll pick one.
Two more quick ones.
Can I do one more here?
You sure can.
Thank you. I was wondering, it seems like a lot of the research is focused on Maine and Maine history, but are there projects in other states or other areas of the country with similar goals who have perhaps gotten close to finding that recipe that you're looking for, whose knowledge you can draw from?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I think what you're highlighting is that across the US and across the globe, right now we're in a period where concepts around resilience, concepts around climate change preparedness are becoming thematic glue to the many other priorities that we already have. I often will say that it's not about prioritizing climate change. It's about recognizing that climate change affects all the things that we already prioritize. I think there's been a major shift in trying to turn that from an idea into an operational reality. And so most of the work that I've been involved with has been learned as an iteration from some other activity elsewhere. And across the CCAP network, there are some people who are true experts in sector-specific vulnerabilities, and they'll be using the tools that were developed elsewhere, developed in either urban or rural environments throughout the world, and have brought them and recreated them for Maine. And so again, to steer people towards that network, because I think that's going to be your fastest track to understand what is the shared convened knowledge from adaptation at a much larger scale and how it fits into Maine's context.
Last one.
And yeah, short one.
Yeah. If we wanted to become you, what should we do?
I feel like I'm one of so many people who are dedicated to this work and are really willing to say, hey, it's not about me, it's about the overall outcomes. And by focusing on those objectives and those goals, it really helps people to work together. So I'm a very happy cog in this wheel, but not necessarily much more. And for fun on the call, for the number of people who have tuned in, I'd be really interested to know how many are either affiliated with CCAP, have been working with the Maine Climate Council, or have directly worked with CTCS. If you want to just do a thumbs up icon on your video, I think you'll see that this community is really cohesive and has a vision that's even more so for the future.
And Linda, that was such a great question. I'm going to attempt to answer one part of it for Parker. For some of the people that have already signed up to talk to him next for this career discussions with sustainability professionals, maybe that's something they can ask him. In other words, they're interested in their own careers in this space, and folks in the room that want to go down there too. We're going to go down the room to room 111, but let's thank Parker again for a great talk and for such great work with so many great colleagues.